Polina Pompliano is the author of Hidden Genius, The Secret Ways of Thinking That Power the World's Most Successful People. It is an awesome book. It is a super quick read that is like jam-packed with so much content and greatness. She's also the founder of The Profile, which is a media organization that studies successful people and companies. And she releases a weekly newsletter that profiles, again, successful people around the world. Previously, she spent 5 years at Fortune, where she wrote more than 1,300 articles and earned the trust of prominent investors and entrepreneurs. As the author and editor of Term Sheet, Fortune's industry-leading deal-making newsletter, Polina interviewed the industry's most influential deal makers, including Melinda Gates, Steve Case, Chamath Palihapitiya, and
nice. Nice pronunciation.
I think that works, right?
That was great.
Perfect. I listen to enough All In where I hear it, constantly every single week. Awesome. Okay, so to kick it off, Polina, like at ZayZoon, one of the things that we really try to embed within the company, and again, like the whole purpose of Drink and Think, is this concept of mastery and staying curious. And we believe that like being curious and having this mastery trait can quickly be followed by an opportunity of creativity. And so obviously like the Profile and Hidden Genius both seem like they've been really built through this value of curiosity. And I'm curious if you can just take a moment to talk about that and how you leverage curiosity and really lean into that core value of yours.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think for a lot of people, curiosity, and probably for a lot of the people here right now, curiosity is almost innate. You don't know a world without it. For me, I think I recognized that very early on. I was just like a nosy child. Like very quickly, my family and I was born in Bulgaria. And then in 1999, my dad won a green card in the green card lottery. So we ended up moving to Atlanta, Georgia when I was 8. So we got here. I didn't speak any English. And for some of you may know, when you're a kid, you don't speak English. Kids are brutal in school. Obviously, you're like the weird kid. And you're new to the school. It's just an awful combination. But it was the first time where I realized that if I wasn't curious, I wouldn't survive. Like it was curiosity is something that I've always just kind of been interested in the way things work and the way the world works. But also, when you don't speak English, you have to be hyper aware of social cues and understanding what people are trying to tell you, where you're supposed to go, how to do your homework, why certain kids sit in certain places in the cafeteria. You become really, really good at like observing and learning and paying attention to body language, social cues, the undertext of something. You're not just like listening to the words they're saying, you're paying attention to the context and the nuance. And I think my whole life, I've been more interested in the nuance of things and the nuance of people than just the superficial. So, both of my parents were chemical engineers. I always thought I would be into like chemistry. So I went to a school that had a special program for like chemistry. I was in the science magnet program and I took like biotech and organic chemistry and whatever in 10th grade. And it was really, really difficult. But what it taught me is because I was curious, I really liked the research aspect of the thing. I didn't like doing the experiments. I just liked writing the lab reports and the research papers. And from there, I kind of weaseled my way into the newspaper class in high school. And then it took off. I was a very introverted child. I really did like observing people. I didn't like being the center of attention. But the newspaper class taught me like, hey, when it's for a job, you can talk to anybody and you can ask them any question that you want. So it literally take like throughout my life, curiosity has been a huge part of it, mainly because I realized that asking questions can a lead you down rabbit holes that you never knew existed, introduce you to new people, and also like help you learn about yourself.
So thanks so much, Paulina. That's yeah, super insightful. You know what's interesting is like finding the nuance in things and like being super curious. Um, One thing you said before, I've listened to it on a podcast. You talked about a professor that you had, and like, you talk about having this innate curiosity, but then when you were writing this paper on a classmate, it seemed like that innate curiosity maybe wasn't totally there. And I'm wondering if you can like A, share the quote that your professor said, because I think it's so powerful, and then B, like the impact of that statement he made on you, and how that maybe like, yes, like you obviously had a ton of great social cues growing up, and you clearly have a really high EQ in that sense. But how did you take that comment and that sort of development, and like take that to the nth degree of where you are now?
Yeah. So it wasn't for a lack of curiosity, it was more of an expectation. So I was taking this introductory journalism class in college, and I had a professor, and our assignment, one of the assignments in the class was pick a classmate and profile them, which looking back now, like that should have been amazing for me. But I kind of, I was like, yeah, sure, this sounds like a piece of cake. I was already writing for the college paper. I was like, no problem. So I get paired with this other student, and and he was just very shy and introverted, didn't have a lot to say, or he just wasn't into the assignment. So I was asking him questions about his life, and he didn't respond with these amazing stories like I expected him to. I was like, man, you're just a regular guy. Like it didn't seem that I was like, how am I going to write an article off of this? And so my solution was to go to my professor and say, "Can I just switch my partner because I somehow have like the most boring person on the planet." And my professor taught me a lesson. He probably doesn't even, remember this, but taught me a lesson that was still stuck with me to this day. He said, "Nobody is inherently boring. They're only boring because you haven't asked the right questions yet." And so I was like, damn it. I see what you're doing. You're right. But it really taught me, like, first of all, nobody owes you anything. And a lot of times people don't think like a journalist. When you're interviewing someone, they don't think about it as in like, "Ooh, what's the hook gonna be? How is she gonna, introduce this anecdote and then end it really nicely? And how does it fit with the theme of my life and the story?" So they're just answering your questions. If you're asking a lot of black and white, this or that questions, they're going to respond with yes and no answers. So the key is to really dial in. I've almost perfected it at this point. When I started at Fortune, you have limited time with these people. Melinda Gates, I had 30 minutes. What can you get in 30 minutes? Not that much. So you kind of what I do is I go in with questions, right? Things that I want to know. Before this, I've done a bunch of research on the person. I understand what they get asked a lot, so I try not to ask those things because I can get that anywhere. I want to get something a little bit more nuanced, something maybe they haven't thought about. And a lot of these CEOs, media trained, they give answers like that. Everything sounds the same. So what I do is I have my questions. I go in. I know that the first 10 to 15 minutes of an interview are going to be kind of the like the icebreaker. It's going to be the warming up. Can I trust this person? They're kind of trying to suss you out. What I found really valuable is being a human being. So if they say something, I offer something personal back and they feel immediately disarmed. This happened to me recently. I'm publishing an interview next week with a really well known NFL player. And I didn't wanna ask him anything about football. I was like, "Can I go this entire," but, like, I didn't wanna ask him about the sports and the things that people normally ask him. I wanted to ask him, like, deeper questions than that and things maybe that he doesn't normally get asked. So, in the first 15 minutes, it was an hour-long interview. The first 15 minutes, you can tell he's kinda guarded, his answers are really short, and then there's, like, a clear trigger and he changes. And you can see more of his personality. You can see that he's actually thinking when he's answering. It's really cool. And I think that that's partially because I often in my interviews, I don't talk like a robot and I don't ask my questions. I offer something like, oh, well, like I was interviewing the founder of Panera Bread, and he was saying how you need your establishment needs to make people feel special. And there's a feeling attached to you entering a McDonald's versus a Panera Bread versus something else. And I told him how different it was growing up in Bulgaria. McDonald's was a nice ass restaurant. It was America. It was everything. It was where dreams were made. When we moved to Atlanta, Georgia, we walked into a McDonald's and I was like, yeah, no, this is not the same. So it's like, so I told him that, and that led down a different thing. So I just think like for me now, it's the quality of the questions, but it's also actually listening to the person and pulling on something they said. And like Tay earlier, I was talking about paying attention to the subtext of a conversation. A lot of times you'll notice, especially if you watch a lot of interviews with people, they'll emphasize certain things, downplay certain things, avoid talking about certain things. Those are the most interesting to me. Like, if you can pay attention to what somebody repeats over and over and over again, they probably kind of, that's like their best foot forward. What do they emphasize is how they want to be seen, and then what they downplay or avoid, like maybe that's the thing to ask them about.
I love that, and it relates to something that another really great interviewer, Tim Ferriss, talks about, right? He talks about creating vulnerability with the interviewee because it helps, take their guard down and create some trust and willingness to share more. Super tactical, but is there, and I know that, good interviewing comes from pulling on different threads, and you kind of need to build into that. Like you're talking, 10, 15 minutes into it, you start to see that guard come down. Are there any specific questions that you ask though to help prompt some of those thread pulls? Uh, and I suppose like it's going to be specific to the individual themselves, but I'm curious if there's any more generalized questions that are asked, or some of your favorites.
Yeah, it's not an exact question, but it's like a format. So I learned this from I was researching Ira Glass, who NPR's This American Life podcast, and also when I interviewed Brandon Stanton, Humans of New York creator. They both do these like really deep interviews where you get these things from people, and you're like, how on earth you just met this stranger? Why are they telling you this? That, I often find, Brandon told me this. He was like, "I always look for, the gap." So, the gap meaning reality versus expectation. How did you think your life was gonna, uh, shape up to be, and what is it actually? And then he asks a lot of, what do you regret? How are you different now than you were when you were starting your career? Is there anything that is unfinished? Like he's looking for the gap in somebody's life, because it tells you a lot about what they value or what they wish they had done, things like that. That's one. And then the second one that I ask every single person I interview is, how do you define the word success? Because I also think that question tells you, in a very short period of time, tells you a lot about what they value in life. If they answer with material things, you're like, uh-huh. And if they answer with more like, I've been through this and now I changed my mind and I value this, like I think this is what success is, it tells you a lot. It's really interesting. I don't know if everybody feels this way, but when I meet a new person, whether I'm interviewing them or just in my regular life, I don't actually know what kind of like how I feel about them or what kind of person they are until I step away and then look back at the conversation. Because sometimes people can be incredibly charming in the moment and you're listening to them, you're, oh wow, like they can sell you anything. And then you step away and you're like, what on earth was that? Because you're actually processing what they said. So for me, it's a lot of that. Like I'll interview someone, I'll think it's the best interview on the planet. Then I step away and I'm like, I think that was just a bunch of bullshit and it wasn't like practical. The things that I like are like things that are actually practical that you can take away and apply to your own life. And that's kind of what I try to do with the book. But to answer your question, it is very much like I look for the gaps um in judgment, in the way your life turned out, in the way like you had one narrative of the world and then it shifted later as a result of something. I was reading this recently and maybe my husband told me. I can't remember who told me, but they were talking about how every person's life basically has a fall. And it's like who you were before the fall and who you are after the fall. Um, and it's really interesting because you'll notice a lot of ego, a lot of superiority and stuff before the fall. Then they fall, and then it's those people, if they're able to achieve something else or reinvent themselves after the fall, that you see a change in their character. You see the you know uh, they're less egotistical, they're much more humble. Maybe they attribute a lot of things to luck. They're just trying to be to, they're a more humble person. But I like those stories too, like the stories of transformation and reinvention.
That reminds me sort of at a in a more meta way, like the stories of transformation and reinvention. It reminds me of a quote that you've said before in talking about, I think it's Sarah Blakely of
Mm,
Spanx, where her dad would ask her at the dinner table, what did you fail at today? And it was sort of like if she came back and didn't have a failure, her dad would say like, well, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. And so like I think over time, like you're saying, like that can remove that ego and just recognize like your own journey on success and redefinition of success. Susie has a question in chat. She's asking,
yes.
so what's your definition of success?
That's great. My definition is very much like a life well lived or personal fulfillment of some sort. It's going to be different for everybody. Um, my fulfillment and what makes me happy will be different from yours. But I always look for the stories of like achievement, then miserable failure, then learning, then achievement in something, whatever it may be that means a lot to you again, and then sharing those lessons that you learned with everybody else. And like David Goggins is an example, Sarah Blakely's an example. I like those people because their journeys are not linear, they're very winding. And they're like messy, like there's beauty in the mess. um, and so to me, success is honestly a life well lived, is how I describe it. I used to value a lot of status, like Fortune editor at Fortune magazine, money. I mean, but like I used to value material things until you realize that those are all external things that can be taken away from you. And I'm not the first editor at Fortune magazine. I'm also not going to be the last. So it's like when you wrap your identity around a job title or something like that, you are allowing somebody else to control that success. Um, because they can take it away from you at any moment. That's why I'm like a huge proponent of do something on the side that makes you personally fulfilled. The highest grossing newsletter on Substack is one about salads. So it's like you can take any hobby that you have and make it doesn't even have to make money. you just have to like do something that nobody can take away from you. And I the thing that changed my definition of what success meant is I read this speech by Anna Quinlan. It was a commencement speech in 1999, and in it she talks about like when I was when I quit the New York Times to be a full-time mother, people said I was crazy. When I said now I'm going to write a book, people said I was crazy. When I did this other thing, people said I was crazy. And she's like, well, you know what she was like, I'm not crazy. What I am is happy and free. And she quotes Lily Tomlin, and uh, she says, you know, even if you win the rat race, you're still a rat. So it's like all of those things were kind of in my head. And I was like, what am I actually doing? Like, what is this, all of this for? So I never thought I'd quit my full time job at Fortune magazine to be the founder of a newsletter called The Profile, but I did it because that's what made me fulfilled. And I feel 1,000 times more successful doing that than I would if I had stayed at Fortune for another 5 years.
Amazing. I'm gonna put a pin in that. I'm gonna come back to the Fortune to Profile journey, because I think that's super interesting. I have a few questions on that. I know Philip has his hands up.
I
Do you want to ask a
do.
question, Philip?
Where
Well,
are you, Philip?
hi, how's it going? So
Hey,
yeah, you kind of started answering my question, so I don't think like if you're repeating yourself, feel free to tell me, hey, I already answered this.
no.
So me being a researcher, I know there are certain research projects, even certain interviews that I've done, and once you kind of walk away from those interviews, you kind of realize, okay, I'm not the same person, and I never was the same person after those interviews. So what I'm interested, especially like as I was working on more difficult projects like in the academia and business, not so much, but you meet some amazing people and you're doing some interviews in business. But my question for you is, what was the probably either the most influential interview for you, and what were the kind of takeaways from that interview, and how did that change you?
Mm, great question. So I find I get the most from the most unexpected people. I go in thinking it'll be one type of person, like I have my preconceived notions of how it'll be, and then they surprise me completely with their life story or the way their perspective on their life story. So, do you guys know who Francis Ngannou is? Yeah, okay, a few. MMA heavyweight champion of the world, amazing. But I don't know anything about sports, so I'm not that interested in that stuff. And then I heard his life story on a Joe Rogan podcast. And then I reached out to him to do an interview because he was going to be in my book. And he was like, sure. So so I interviewed him, and in his story, in a very small nutshell, is he was born in Cameroon, very, very poor, but had dreams of becoming a professional boxer. And people were like, you're insane. You know, you're working at the sand mines for $1 a month. And he he just it was in his head that he was going to go to America and be a professional boxer. And so at some point he was like, I'm going to leave here because I there are no good training facilities in Cameroon. So I'm going to go to the big city. And so he oh gosh, the journey was crazy. It was like Cameroon to Niger to Nigeria, Nigeria to I think Algeria, Algeria to Morocco, Morocco to Spain. Um, and then from there, he ended up in Paris, homeless. But he found a gym, and he walked into the gym. He was like, I want to be a boxer. Somebody noticed him. He was like, oh, you're like a really big guy. Like, we can work with you. But then the gym shut down. And then his trainer was like, well, there's an MMA gym. Well, this is an MMA gym. Like, you can do something in MMA. He's like, I don't even know what that is, but okay. So he got really good, and he ended up in the US, MMA champion in a sport he didn't even know existed 9 years before that. So I listened to his story, and he said a few things that really challenged the way I thought about certain things. So I asked him, I was like, well, like you've been this fighter for so long. Now you're on your next chapter. Um, what is your identity? Like, who are you going to be now? And he was like, Paulina, I don't think like that. Like, I don't like, I'm Francis. I don't wrap my identity around a title. And he's the one who was like, there have been many MMA champions before me, there'd be many after me. I just know that you can take everything away from me, but I have the skills to rebuild. He wasn't afraid of failing. He wasn't afraid of starting over. He was like, I've seen, poverty. You can't scare me with that. Like, he was just so resilient and so sufficient. I thought that was really interesting. And the second thing that he said, that was great, was before the interview started, actually, he asked me about Bulgaria. And I was like, yeah, my parents won a green card in the green card lottery. He goes, oh, you must think you're very lucky. And I was like, I mean, yeah, it's the lottery. Like, and he said, I played that every year. Like, I entered, Cameroon also had a green card lottery. He was like, I enter that every year, never got it. But he was like, I always thought if I had won the green card lottery, everybody would call me lucky. But then I would come to the US the easy way, and I'd probably work as like a security guard somewhere. But if I hadn't gone on this insane journey, I would never become who I am. Maybe he would, but he probably not. Um, my path wouldn't have quite led me to where I am today. So he's like, I feel lucky to not have won that lottery. So I kind of reframe luck in my mind a little bit, because who's to say that I'm lucky because my life turned out this way because I won the green card lottery, whereas he didn't, and he did this other thing. So I thought that was really interesting.
That's incredible. I remember reading that when you wrote it, and like the reframing of that is wild. And also, I think that's a really fitting answer because Philip is a huge jujitsu fan. So
Oh,
he knows
cool.
really well.
Well,
Okay, so you talked about sort of fortune going into the profile. Talking about like adversity. I'm obviously fortune to the profile is adversity in a much smaller way than moving countries and doing what Francis did. But I know there was like still a very tough decision. So I'd love for you to kind of chat about like the one-way versus two-way door. That's a concept that we use a lot at ZayZoon for decision making. And then actually, yeah, let's start there. And then I
yeah.
have some questions about the profile.
Yeah, so I don't actually know who said this quote. Some people say it's Jeff Bezos, others say it's somebody else. But basically, he said, make reversible decisions quickly and irreversible ones deliberately. And the whole idea is like, by making like decisions quickly, you can, even if you fail, you can learn a lot from them. But the irreversible ones you should make slowly and deliberately, because you can't go back. If you want to have children for the rest of your life, you will be a parent. There is no like reversing that. So for me, for some reason, I think when you're an immigrant or the child of immigrants, in your head you kind of see that struggle, or you go through that struggle, and you're like, I'm going to find something really safe and comfortable and with health insurance that I can't ever lose. So to me, that thing was Fortune. When I joined Fortune 2014, I thought like I'd made it. I was like, this is going to be the rest of my life. It was journalism. I loved it. It was a corporate job, meaning it was a bigger company. I had it wasn't a startup. It was secure. And then you see, I mean, every year of me being there were always these like media cycles where people would get laid off. I fortunately never made enough money to be laid off, but I saw a lot of my coworkers get laid off, lose their jobs. These, investigative journalists, you're like, I cannot believe this can happen to anybody. So media has always been a volatile industry. So there wasn't really security there. I just had made it up in my mind that I was irreplaceable. But then when it came to the point to make the decision of, do I stay at Fortune or do I go full time on this thing that's a newsletter? And at the time when I was making this decision in January of 2020, there were no other mainstream media reporters who had left their jobs to start to go full time on a Substack. Many had started as a side thing, which I had done as well, but nobody had been like, I am leaving to do this and make it a business. So I didn't have anybody to talk to. So to me, it felt like this massive decision, and I call it that I was on the seesaw of misery. I would wake up like, I'm doing it today. I'm telling them I'm leaving, and then I would go to sleep and be like, "Are you nuts?" Like, no. I mean, who's gonna pay for a weekly newsletter? And also, I think I learned to challenge some of the things that I had heard in college and just early in my career, which was that if you are a writer, you could never be an entrepreneur, and that like people don't pay for writing. Only advertisers pay for to be next to your writing. That's how you make money, but the reader will never pay directly. So I was like, I don't know. I have all these concerns. I made a pro and con list of things that could go wrong, things that could go right. And on my list of concerns and risks was like, oh, at Fortune, I write about venture capital and startups and the economy and markets. And I was like, we're at the end of a 10-year cycle. There's a recession definitely coming. We're right here. I don't know. Am I about to like walk into a recession? The second was like, I don't know, like disappointing someone or things like that. And then the only thing that I didn't have on my list, which was a global pandemic, ended up happening. Um, Literally, I gave Fortune 3 weeks notice. So I told them at the beginning of March, before COVID was really a thing. And then by March 20th, which was my last day, it was the first day of lockdowns in New York. And I was like, wow, I really miscalculated that one. But it was weirdly a blessing in disguise because a lot of people now were at home, working from home, uh, had more time to read. And I think once they had exhausted all the, junk content options, they were like, okay, I'm willing to pay for really high quality content. And that's what the profile offered. So it weirdly worked out at that time to have a Substack to launch. So I don't regret it at all. It actually turned out to be amazing. But it was making the decision because if I ultimately leaving your job is a reversible decision. If I had left Fortune and I tried the profile and fell flat on my face, I could always go get another job, whether it's another media company or somebody would hire me. But irreversible would be really, really wishing that I could try doing this profile thing full time, never doing it. And then 30 years later, I get interviewed by somebody like me, and they're like, what do you regret the most? And I'm like, damn it. Should have done that thing.
The team, I saw a few members of our team like have PTSD there because
What happened, Tate?
March 20th of 2020, yeah, Darcy covers his ears. Our business went from a success to being chopped in more than half overnight because of all those lockdowns, right? We service people by giving them access to their wages prior to payday.
Yeah.
But when no paydays are happening, no people are coming in to access their wages early. So that was a very stressful time for the ZayZoon team. But it was looking back, it was I don't know about fun, but it makes for a good story. It's one of those
Definitely
things
not fun. Yeah.
where the toughness makes for a good story, I guess. Another thing that I'll just say, like I heard it on another interview that you had, Paulina, and I think it like wraps in nicely to you kind of like going off and doing your own thing. I think it was your husband, Anthony, that said like, never let anyone believe in you more than you believe in yourself. And I thought that was like really pertinent because, we all deal with imposter syndrome a ton, and we deal with like, issues of confidence, but I thought that was a really good quote. Okay, so you made the shift to the profile, and I'm assuming you made that shift because you love writing so much and you love interviewing so much and kind of flexing that curiosity muscle. But then like all of a sudden you're running a business and it extends far beyond like the passion of writing and interviewing, you're now dealing with subscribers, and I'm sure doing your own accounting in the back end, and like running this, what was a small business at the time. Like what has been difficult about meshing those worlds? And then is that changing? I noticed in your last profile, I believe talked about you're cutting the consistency a little bit. You're not going to release it every week now. So I'm just curious, like, yeah, what has changed in those worlds? And how did you go about meshing them?
Yeah. So, like, it's always challenging when you're like, quote unquote, a creative person trying to build a business. It's helpful to have people around you who can basically guide you and to make better decisions. So for example, at one point I had this idea of like a really big project, would take me months. I would need a photographer or whatever. And I told my husband, and he was like, well, okay, is that going to result in subscribers or revenue, or how is that going to help your bottom line? Or are you just doing it purely for the fun of it? And I was like, what are you talking about? This is great content. People want this. And I've tried a few things. Some of them have worked, some of them haven't. But the whole point is that I think when you work at a large media organization, everything is taken care of. So you can focus on just one thing. When you have to do both, you constantly have to ask yourself the question, am I going to spend a ton of time and energy on this thing, do it, and then nobody reads it? Like, what's the point? So maybe I should work on the distribution more versus taking 2 months and working on this really, really intense thing. So it's like, surround yourself with the right people. If you're not, and know your blind spots. If you're, one of your blind spots is like business, find people who can help you with that you can ask questions to. And then the second is, a recent decision I made. I am not cutting the consistency on the main newsletter. This is important because I talk a lot about consistency, and it's actually why it was really hard making this decision. So I have a Sunday newsletter for the profile that curates like 7 to 8 really long form, solid, interesting profiles of people that I send every Sunday morning. I have not missed a single Sunday since February of 2017. And I have, knock on wood, I hope I don't miss one in the future. But then in 2020, I added another edition of the newsletter that comes out on Wednesday, which is called the Profile Dossier. And this, I haven't missed a Wednesday since then, but at this point, I probably have hundreds of deep dives of individual people that I've studied. So that comes out every Wednesday. The problem is that to do that, basically what I do is I spend Monday and Tuesday hardcore listening to podcasts, watching interviews with these people, like diving very deep into one person and then writing an edition of the newsletter about them. Sometimes maybe I've interviewed them, the majority of the time I have not interviewed them. So it's all curated. And then lately I've kind of been feeling a little like, I don't know, unsettled or aimless. Like it feels like a machine. I'm just doing it, but I'm not stopping to reflect and I don't feel fulfilled. I'm like, what is missing? And I realized I still do some consulting with Fortune where I will go to Fortune magazine's like conferences and I'll moderate, like I'll interview people on stage. So I was like, man, that just gives me so much life, like interviewing people. And then I asked myself, I was like, when did I stop doing that for the profile? And the reason I stopped doing it is because I don't have time. I was focusing Monday and Tuesday on this one edition that goes out on a Wednesday. Then Thursday, Friday, and part of Saturday, I'm reading these really in-depth, long-form profiles that go in the Sunday edition. So there's no time to be like, oh, let me reach out to people that I can interview or do all this stuff. And I realized I became a curator instead of an interviewer, and interviewing is actually what gives me life. So I was trying to think of like, how can I incorporate that, but without, diminishing the quality of the profile. And I decided that instead of the Wednesday dossier, I would publish an original interview on Wednesday. I published one last Wednesday. I'm going to publish one this Wednesday. I'm trying to get more lined up, but I told the readers I'm not making a promise that it's going to be every single Wednesday. It's going to be higher quality, interviews that I want to do that I personally find interesting, and you'll get them. You may get one this Wednesday, next Wednesday, but not for another 2 weeks. So I think the biggest thing I struggled with is the consistency. I was like, I talk a lot about consistency, but this is one thing where I think that the quality and the focus of the interviews is better than you getting a mediocre thing on Wednesday that I've curated. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. That makes total sense. Did you make a pros and cons list for that?
I did not this time, but I thought long and hard. I went on the seesaw of misery again.
I heard you saying, I think in an interview or maybe written on Twitter somewhere, you are what you prioritize. And so, I mean, I think like that's a perfect example of it, right? Like you're wanting to prioritize in what you're deciding makes a good life, or like a life well lived, right? And leaning into the interview side of things. We have like just under 15 minutes left, so I do want to prompt people to ask questions if they have any. I'm happy to continue through this, but I know that if anyone is waiting to throw a hand up, no need to wait.
I see a question in the chat. I don't know if that's yeah.
Susie, go for it.
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but I can just speak, I guess. So we're actually launching a newsletter here at ZayZoon. We're like very, very early on. I'm wondering if you have any tips on how to like really appeal to an audience in a sincere way, like not coming off of like, I think it's so important what you're saying of like making sure that it's something that you want to do, but also, something that people want to read and that is authentic. In a way, is one of the things that we're like really trying to get at. Do you have any tips for me?
And what is the newsletter about?
So it's called Purple Squirrel, and it's for HR and people leaders. So it's got like insights and data-driven stats and like different ways of approaching your day-to-day job. So the idea is like a purple squirrel is like it's like a unicorn, right? It's like a unique candidate. It's an exceptional way of doing things. And the idea is that by subscribing to Purple Squirrel, we can provide that value and help people really shine and really like, kick ass in their meetings, basically, and at their role. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a great question. So I always say, like, I learned this at Fortune actually. So there I was writing Term Sheet, which is the daily deal making newsletter. Before I started writing it, there had been 2 prior writers, but it was Fortune Magazine's newsletter. So this sounds like it's ZayZoon's newsletter, but I would make it super, super human. So I learned at Fortune that like people subscribe to people, not faceless institutions. So I would think long and hard about whether you guys want to send it from a person, because if you do, it could be great, even if that person doesn't exist, if it's like a fake name, because just, I don't know, there's a human element to, I'm reading something that's not just like a company talking to me. I have enough of those newsletters, and make it voicey. Like it sounds like your brand is not a boring brand. So make the newsletter have a point of view and a voice. And then I always thought about newsletters as a mirror to the public or to the readers, to the subscribers of the newsletter. So basically you want to hold up a mirror to them and be like, this is what the community is, and this is what you guys want, and I am here to deliver it. It's how I did it at Fortune is I would offer my analysis and opinion a lot, but a lot of times when I would get a lot of criticism, I just published the criticism. Be like, here's what you guys actually think, That's, I think, more rare for companies to do, to acknowledge like, hey, you guys didn't like this, here's what we did differently, or etc. Or I would ask them questions to for example, what are your predictions for investing in 2021 or whatever? And people would write in, I would compile it, here it is. And I think when people write back to a newsletter, they don't expect a response. When you respond, that's helpful. But when you include them in the newsletter, there's like a skin in the game type thing, and they become much more loyal. So I think those things.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the concept of curated responses is a really great one. Tim, I see you have your hand up. I have one little follow-up question though first for Polina. Again, I've heard you say,
this is great.
I'm never stopped because of perfection. And so like I took that anyways as you're saying, like just ship it, like just throw it out there and see what sticks. And so like in this new newsletter that's being launched, you know, monthly consistency, trying to figure out what works. You can see like through Susie's questions, we're trying to figure it out still, right?
Yeah.
I guess in like a very broad sense, like I'd love for you to just expand on like how you think of shipping stuff and just throwing it out there and getting it in the public eye. And then when you refine it, because obviously now you're at a point where you have a lot more success, you have a lot larger of an audience. Are you focused more on that refining, or are you still very much, you know, throwing stuff at the wall?
Yeah, well, as you can tell with the going to interviews versus the thing, I'm still very much trying to figure it out. But I think the monthly cadence is right. So the thing that the biggest mistake I see people make when somebody comes to me and is like, I want to start a newsletter, I'm like, please don't. Because the truth is that you're going to be inconsistent. Most people are like, we're going to start a daily newsletter and we're going to be so consistent, never going to miss a day. That's not true. Start with something monthly. If it ends up being very, if you think you can do more, go to weekly. And I always say it's easier to speed up than it is to slow down, because when you start really hot and you make a bunch of promises and then you break them, the reader's like, whatever, like this person is inconsistent, I can't trust them. But when you start slow and speed up, people actually feel like they're getting more value. And that's the end that you want to be on. And then the other thing that I learned is the perfection thing. I didn't realize that that's actually a weirdly like good trait, that I don't wait until I feel like something is perfect. Ed Catmull, who's the co-founder of Pixar, he says this. He's like, you know, by the way, even though Pixar makes these amazing films that win awards, even when we put it out there, we still think it's shit. We just like think it's the best form of shit that we've been able to create. So you know, I've had friends who are like, I'm gonna launch this perfect thing and whatever, and then they launch and then the website like doesn't work. And you're like, well, it looks beautiful, but I can't use it. So that's a fail. So I think for me, when I launched the profile, I was under no impression that I know I'm not a designer. I know it's not gonna look good. Everything was bad about it. Every single thing, the formatting, the voice, like everything was off, except for the thing that I promised, which was you're gonna get 8 really good long form profiles. So it's like, make your promise, that's your foundation. Everything else you can iterate and get feedback, because you don't actually know what it'll turn into until you get the feedback. And Humans of New York is actually a really good example of this. He thought that he was gonna go photograph 10,000 New Yorkers and have really and plot them on a map, and then have an app where you can see. I don't know what it was a weird idea, but like it makes sense when he explains it. But then when he posted one photo on Facebook and people were like, whoa, that's really cool, I want to hear more from that person, then he added one quote from that person. Then people were like, I want to hear more. And that's how it became what it is today, which is like long form, deep interviews. But it started off with a totally different idea. So the whole thing is like, you probably thought that was perfect until the market or people weighed in and then got better.
That's incredible. I had no idea on that. And it makes total sense. And it's something that, yeah, I mean, I think any company struggles with that, but yeah, it's defining like perfection versus just tossing something out there and getting that feedback. Tim,
Yeah.
you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So Paulina, thank you for writing the book. Really well written, really well researched.
Thank you.
Great job with it. Now that you've had a chance to hear feedback on the book and reflect on what's in the book, what's the chapter that's not in the book that maybe you wish would have been in the book at this stage?
Wow, that's such a good question. Sorry, I cut out for a second, I think. That's such a good question. Let me think. So the way I structured the chapters were patterns that I've seen from a bunch of these people that I've either interviewed or learned from. I think that given kind of ZayZoon's like Iceberg Principle, I think I would say maybe something on failure that is like unresolved failures, but I would have to do it in a way where I'm trying to think, because I'm thinking about kind of like right now I'm in the process of thinking about my next book. And I'm like, exactly, like what was left on the table that I didn't. But honestly, I would love to hear from what you think was left, because to me that was like the best version of whatever I started with. The thing that I started with was actually like a book of mental models, and then I was like, does the world really need another book of mental models? Probably not. So I changed that. But I don't know. What do you think, Tim?
I like the idea of failure, maybe a little bit about regret, but that's been written. You touched on that in this talk. Daniel Pink already wrote a great research book on regret, so I don't know how you take that a little bit further, but I think the failure of the ups and downs and how you recover from those downs is really interesting. I don't know. I was curious. Give it some thought and would love to connect maybe offline sometime.
Yeah, please email me. Yeah, absolutely. Polina, readtheprofile.com.
Okay.
Ooh, I'm so curious now. Is the next book going to be like Hidden Genius 2.0, or is it like a long
Hidden
profile?
Failures? No.
Hidden Failures?
No.
Yeah, I'm super curious.
No, I don't know yet. I think I think that's also part of the reason why I'm like, I want to do more interviews, is I think I'll generate better ideas that way. So we'll see. I don't know yet. It's very uncertain.
Interesting. Well, and it's super interesting too, like, because you talk about like your identity and like wrapping that up into something, and like I'm assuming now your identity is probably more wrapped to like what you're doing than it has ever been before. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but like I would assume with like the new title of author and like the new book and everything, like you might be finding yourself wrapped in an identity, and now like what's next in that journey, right?
Yeah, although I don't, it's really interesting. I have a really hard time when people, I went to a comedy show, like a stand-up comedy show the other day with two friends, and I normally sit like all the way in the back, but they unfortunately sat us in the front because we were late and there were like no seats left. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. And the guy was like, what do you do? And I was like, I don't, I don't know. He was not very like, he was like, all right, so you're unemployed. But I think I really don't, I don't know. Like the book is great. It's just another thing that I did. I don't see myself as like an author now because I've always been writing. Also, I think if you tell somebody, if you introduce yourself and you're like, hi, I'm Polina, I'm an author, they think you're like, selling crystals down the street. I don't know. I don't think that it's a very good connotation.
That's totally fair. Okay, we have like 2 minutes left. Cody, I saw you had your hand up. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll call it there. But go for it, Cody.
Cool. So I know you said you're naturally like extremely curious. Is there anything specifically that you do to train your curiosity? And then I got a follow-up question if there's time.
Yeah. So So in the first chapter on creativity, I talk a little bit about this. I've almost like trained myself to see the world through like a specific lens. So for example, I carry around this like tiny notebook. I was looking for it earlier. It's not here, it's in my bag, but I carry it around with me. And like anytime I see something interesting, I write it down, even if it's not an idea that like I want to pursue now. I'm like, maybe I'll connect it somehow in the future. But just writing it down and like looking at things, you're training yourself to move through the world noticing things. There's so many things like that's how I came up with a series in 2020 called The Faces of American Business, because I was walking down the street in New York and I was like, oh my God, like every single establishment is closed. I wonder about the humans behind these businesses. So I'm always like kind of that's in the back of my head. And when I thought of that, then I was like, I wonder what they're thinking right now. So I reached out to a bunch, interviewed them, and wrote this series. But like, if I wasn't that, I'd be like, oh, another business shut down. But it's always like, who are the humans behind this? There's a human behind everything. And in the book, I talk about this like really innovative chef who connects ideas from different industries. I think if you can train yourself to do that, that's really powerful.
Awesome. Thanks.
The power of analogies. I love it. All right, cool. Thanks so much, Polina. That was
Thank you.
Incredible. Yeah, I know that we had a offsite earlier this month, and we gave everyone on the team your book, and I know that many of us are reading through it. And yeah, like I said, it's been a great read so far. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you guys.
Today. Thanks for being the first
Email
guest
me.
on the Iceberg Principle.
Yeah. I put my email in the chat. So if you just have comments or want to talk about something, feel free to email me.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you guys.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.